Specifically, would you like to see Sharia have an influence on our civil and criminal courts? What role do you see that?
Well, let me tell you, you're disappointed with my lecture. I'm disappointed with your question. Because it is the typical question of Muslim, prove yourself to us. Muslim, show us, illustrate that we should not be scared of you. We should not be threatened by you. Of course, I understand what you want me to, what you're hoping is that I would fudge the question and say, well, you know, it's complicated. No, it's not complicated. Islamic law has no role in the American criminal system. No direct role, no indirect role. In the same way, the Jewish law has no role. In the same way that canon law has no role. In the same way that any medieval legal system has no role, whether direct or indirect. Scholars can sit there and talk about roots and genesis and origins. I can write an article about the origins of law guilds and inns of courts, and that they originated in the Islamic civilization, influenced the common law system, and that the inns of courts are fundamentally transplanted from an Islamic context. Now, that has nothing to do with the policy decision and political decision of what role should Islamic law, if anything, play in this context and in this country. Very simply, even Islamic law, and this is something that, you know, if you would have bought any book on Islamic law written by a respectable scholar, you would discover Kamali's book is in bookstores. My books are in bookstores. I mean, there are various introductions. Wa al-Hallaq, if you prefer, a Christian Arab writer, also has an introduction to Islamic law that talks about this. Islamic law does not apply beyond its territorial jurisdiction. It does not have a notion of universal jurisdictionality. It does not have an in personam jurisdiction. So once you step outside, even in the classical tradition, outside the territory of Muslims, Islamic law, whether criminal law, commercial law, civil law, has no application. It only applies simply at the ritualistic level, the level of ibadat or worship. Furthermore, there's an immense problem that is often overlooked. Most Muslim countries today do not apply Islamic law in any shape, way, or form. Egyptian criminal law is not based on Islamic law. Turkish law, criminal law is not based on Islamic law. Syrian criminal law, same thing. Jordanian criminal law, same thing. Algerian criminal law, Moroccan criminal law, Tunisian criminal law, Malaysian, Indonesian. The whole controversy arises when countries like Pakistan, like Nigeria, consider introducing what they believe are a criminal sanction taken from the Islamic tradition. And the argument that I've published and many have said repeatedly is that all they are doing is taking a medieval criminal penalty, transplanting it into a modern context, which makes absolutely no sense. Medieval penalties were created within a certain ethical milieu, and that's where they belong. That doesn't mean I denigrate Islamic law. Islamic law is a great tradition. It's a great intellectual tradition. It's a source of inspiration for Muslims all over the world, and should be. And I would support Islamic law in a variety of contexts, but that does not mean that there's a stealth plan to implement Islamic criminal law or to have the United States governed by Sharia or the Caliphate or any of this nonsense. Other questions?
Yes, go ahead.
I hope you're not disappointed in my question.
I tell students, I'm one of those people who believes there are stupid questions, but there are stupid lectures as well.
Okay, to what extent do you think that modern concepts such as tolerance and human rights can be derived through the medieval interpretive tradition from classical texts? when those concepts didn't exist during the time that those texts were composed?
No, that's a really good question. And a very complicated one. And a difficult one to answer. We have the same issue with in the Jewish context, in the Christian context. Take for instance, in the Christian context, the natural law lawyers like John Finnis, for instance, who says, or John White, who says, well, if we ignoring rootedness in a tradition is very dangerous. That if you base law on merely functional considerations, that law becomes very flimsy and very unstable. I'm essentializing and reducing their argument greatly. Or in the Jewish tradition, where a variety of scholars continue to argue on whether the rabbinic tradition or the halachic tradition should act as an inspiration to, and by the way, there are a lot of very good books on Jewish criminal law tradition and whether it inspires any modern institutions. In the Islamic context, there is something that I clearly disagree with, and that is to take a medieval text of law and implement it in totem in the modern context. That's what happens in Saudi Arabia, that's what's happening in Iran. It's ahistorical and completely anthropologically, sociologically, ethically unsound. It ignores the fact of human agency in the production of these texts in the first place. And that's why I said I don't believe Sharia grows out of the Quran, or Sharia is a human construct. It's negotiated by scholars who confronted a civilization with numerous contexts and numerous languages and numerous traditions and numerous cultures, and attempted to balance out what they thought is distinctively Islamic and what is practical and pragmatic. That's fine, but none of these solutions that they worked out can work in the modern age. If implemented verbatim, they're disastrous. Now, having said that, I do believe that there is a lot in the ethical and methodological momentum of the Islamic tradition that can inspire contemporary interpretations of Islamic law. I'm not sure if I would go as far as Finnis in his belief in that law ought to be grounded, for instance, in Christian origins, or I'm not sure if I was Jewish, if I would pass for an Orthodox as opposed to a Reformed. I see the merits of basing interpretation on tradition, and I see the merits of historical rootedness, and I see the merits of negotiating and reconstructing ethics so that they can be reformulated and rehabilitated to various emerging social contexts. So I'll give you a very concrete example. What if books of law that was written in Saudi Arabia, and this is a question that I give to Muslims as well, with quite a bit of controversy, as you can imagine. What if books of law written in Saudi Arabia in the 10th century were taken and applied verbatim in Malaysia or Indonesia, in Sumatra, for instance, or in sub-Saharan Africa, or even in North Africa, in what is today Morocco, Algeria, and so on? I think the consequences would have been disastrous. And if any true students of Islamic law know that the Islamic law of Egypt in the 10th century is very different from the Islamic law of Morocco in the same period, and is yet very different from the Islamic law of Malaysia in the same period. And the Islamic law of the 10th century is very different from the Islamic law of the 16th century. And that there is a constant evolutionary process. And this constant evolutionary interpretive process is this constant attempt to negotiate between authenticity, legitimacy, and socially changing variable factors. And you could go on giving many examples, whether in some of even and this is reflected in everything from commercial law to criminal law to even in ritual law, even in the law of prayer and public rituals, which is itself quite fascinating. I'll give you one more example, but I mean this is exactly the type of stuff that I get excited about. So, even in the field of ritual, one of the things I've noticed here in the United States, is very minor but very telling modification of the Islamic legal tradition. If you read Islamic law books, they tell you that when you go to Friday's sermon, there's only one Friday prayer, one time, it's performed, it's done, that's it. And that you pray, after you pray, which is a congregational prayer, nothing to do, you just go home. Now in the United States, for very different, because there are very different social demands, I've noticed that several Islamic centers hold 2 Friday prayers consecutively, one after the other. If you read the law books, this would be an outrage. But it's a social necessity. People don't have Friday off. People pray during their lunch hour. A lot of people have their lunch hour for 12. Other people have it at 1. Another thing, many people who pray in the United States do not know Arabic. So after prayer, they demand or they ask that the supplications be done publicly with the whole congregation, do it in one voice. So my juristic training makes me a little bit somewhat conservative. I led prayer one place, and after prayer was done, they said, "Can you lead us in supplication?" And I said, "But prayer is done. Go home. No public supplication, no congregational supplication." They said, "But people here don't know Arabic, and you do. So lead us in supplication." And being big-headed and stubborn at the time, I said, "No, I will not. This is not consistent with law books." Afterwards, thinking about it, I said, this is Islamic law in action, in progress. For American Muslims, this is going to be their congregational prayer. And it's going to look very different than congregational prayer in Egypt or congregational prayer in Malaysia or etc., etc. My favorite example is actually in some mosques where, as the person is giving the congregational sermon, several people will interrupt by saying, "Say it, brother. That's right. You've said it." Now, the reason Muslims are laughing is that if you go to congregational prayers in the Arab world, you find everyone sitting silent and a lot of times falling asleep because the sermon is extremely boring most of the times. I think it's part of probably the ethos that the sermon has to be boring. Well, in some American Muslim mosques, the sermon is as lively as evangelical worship. People get into there and a lot of heat and stomp their feet and do all types of things. Very interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead. The Islamic law, we talk about the Islamic system, do they differentiate this between legislative law and case law, or what we call common law? Because you alluded to the laws are changing during the time in each country. But even here, the case law changes upon a new interpretation
Yeah.
that somebody comes up with. So I'm assuming the Islamic law is the same as opposed to...
Well, my students, my students are struggling with this in the course